In Part 1, we discussed the individual parts of the Final Fantasy Prelude and how they work on a purely musical level. This week, we are going to be discussing the evolution of that prelude from its origin to the current form of it. But first, we need to settle this question. What exactly is a prelude? A prelude takes its name from a variety of sources, but found its real popularity in the Baroque era of Western music that spans from about 1600 to 1750. In this era, we finally start to see some of the wider musical traditions such as cadences, motifs, and voice leading really take shape and become the constructs for later composers. Perhaps the most famous examples of preludes come from Johann Sebastian Bach in his Well-Tempered Clavier, written in and about 1722. In this collection of pieces for the clavier, a predecessor of the piano, Bach writes a prelude and fugue for each of the 12 keys. His preludes often hint at what's to come into the much more complicated fugue sections, but really stand out as pieces on their own. Let's listen to just a small snippet from his Prelude No. 1 for C major. It has a very similar rhythmic structure to our Final Fantasy Prelude, doesn't it? Repeated 16th note patterns that only vary with chord changes. Its purpose is to highlight what you will later hear in his fugue for C major, but absolutely has its own musical constructs. Knowing this, how can we view the function of the Final Fantasy Prelude? The Prelude has changed many times over the years. Nobuo Uematsu wrote the Prelude for the original Final Fantasy as an afterthought, written merely in 10 minutes at the end of the production to be placed into the game. After the success of the original game, it became apparent that certain elements could be carried over to new worlds and new stories, and the Prelude has survived alongside other tropes from the series. Through many of the mainline Final Fantasy games, you hear this theme rather prevalently in specific spots. It is played during most games' New Game Select screen and repeatedly in several Game Over screens. It is played during the tutorial rooms from the classic 2D games and even in the crystal rooms from Final Fantasy V. These are not just random places where the prelude feels appropriate, they are series staples. The tutorial rooms from the early games are places where new players learn the basics of the combat and item usage. They usually hold some sort of secret area as well to find nice items that would be expensive to purchase at an early level. The Game Over screens are used as places to launch us back into the load game state, and are essentially the same as a new game menu in their function and feel appropriate for using the prelude. But what happens over time? In the first 3 Final Fantasies, Uematsu is working with a limited sound palette. The NES's hardware capabilities were incredibly limited. Referred to colloquially as chiptune in the modern era, the digital synthesis of waveforms only allowed for certain types of sounds and in very limited amounts. Much of the compositional complexity of Baroque composers like Bach were utilized in these early video game soundtracks to better offset what was simply a lack of technology. These earliest Final Fantasies feature much of the same harp structure we talked about in Part 1, but make note of the very limited tone that's being used. It is a waveform that has been written very cleverly into a pattern of duplicated 16th notes to mask the fact that no more than 3 notes at a time can be processed on the cartridge. Using a style similar to Bach, Uematsu manages to create full chord structures using the limits of technology at the time. Moving on to Final Fantasy IV, we start to achieve higher quality sound overall. The higher bitrate in the Super Nintendo allowed for more voices to be played, and thus, for the first time, we hear the iconic melody that we studied in Part 1. There are many voices playing here, which in music we call polyphony. This trend continues through the rest of the Super Nintendo Final Fantasies, where Uematsu takes more creative risks with his prelude. In Final Fantasy VI's version, it is markedly slower than the previous versions. It allows for more room to breathe in between each chord, and he adds certain flavors into solo instruments. The flute that plays over the synthesized string for the melody has hints of vibrato, emulating how a real flautist would play elongated notes in this style. When Final Fantasy made the jump to CD-ROMs on the PlayStation, Uematsu makes full use of the sounds available to him and the advances in MIDI sampling. The instruments here are much more convincing as strings and brass, and he uses this to his advantage. Gone are the single-layer structures of harp, melody, and chords, if they could all fit on the same cartridge. Now, where there would simply be chords played in the background, Uematsu uses these sounds to propel the ear forward and upward, creating counter-melodies alongside the traditional melody we first heard back in Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy VIII is our first encounter with the prelude in something other than the new game menu or in the introduction. We hear the prelude in both the game over screens and in hints of the finale. With this rededicated purpose, the prelude takes on a much different type of sound with its own introduction to boot. Note here how different the overall track sounds. We are given very different material to listen to, but are reassured that this is our tried and true prelude when the harp does manage to sneak its way in. At this point, the franchise is over a decade old in Japan, and Uematsu has received critical acclaim for his scores. Now, the prelude moves from being just an introductory piece of music to something that has cultural significance, something that signifies the property as a whole and does not need to be relegated to the front or back of the series. As Final Fantasy entered the PS2 era, the prelude tracks become much more sophisticated. Gone are the days of simple MIDI sequencing, and now we can attain full orchestral sampling that would rival most movie scores. The color palette for music has achieved new heights, but this also comes at a time when Uematsu is ready to move on. Uematsu's role in Square Enix lessened as the console transition took place. For Final Fantasy X, Uematsu co-wrote the soundtrack with fellow Square Enix employees Junja Nakano and Masashi Hamauzu. The latter would go on to be the lead composer for Final Fantasy XIII. Uematsu wrote only one song for the development of Final Fantasy XII, the last PS2 Final Fantasy game, while Hitoshi Sakimoto is credited as the lead composer. This is all the result of Uematsu leaving the company in 2004 amicably to start his own recording label and rock band. It is not uncommon to swap creative teams over time. Final Fantasy has seen many changes to its team as time goes on, but replacing Uematsu as lead composer brought many changes to what fans have come to expect from the series' music. The prelude has taken a diminished role as time goes on, serving more as a cultural icon than needed musical tool. In Final Fantasy X, the last major work from Uematsu at Square Enix, the prelude is played in familiar contexts, but the track itself has changed radically. In a tutorial screen, and as part of the opening sequence with Tidus exploring Zanarkand, the prelude sounds altogether very different from its previous incarnations. Final Fantasy XII plays an arrangement of the prelude during an introductory cinematic, but nowhere else. In Final Fantasy XIII, it is played just very briefly at the end credits, but otherwise is completely absent from the game. In fact, 13 has its own titled prelude track, which is its own musical piece, entirely separate from the classic Final Fantasy prelude as we have discussed. So, what can we truly say about all of this? Discussions are often held about what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. Is it the combat? Is it the characters or the story? Is it the crystals or Mako reactors or the summons? To me, Final Fantasy has always been defined by its incredible music. What Nobuo Uematsu has been able to achieve over the years is nothing short of staggering. Taking a fine ear for music, combining it with classic writing techniques, and then molding it around the stories and the characters he has handed, he has managed to craft interesting works that have far outlived the relevancy of the individual games. His music is performed in concert halls by people at open mics, and even in my humble computer room. These notes that he has put together make up something that is altogether really unique, to the point that when I think of any Final Fantasy game, the soundtrack in my head is always the prelude.